Bonjour, bienvenue, and welcome to another voice recording. In this voice recording, I'm going to be reading a post from Quota, and it's titled, "What Would Have Happened If France Had Kept Its American Territories Known as New France?" This is basically a question, and following that question is a couple of posts from different types of people that answered this. And before I read their post, read every single post on this, I'm going to be reading a little about New France. Not a lot. Okay, here's something about New France on Wikipedia. Okay, New France, or in French, Nouvelle France, was the area colonized by France in North America, beginning with the exploration of the Gulf of St. Lawrence by Jacques Cartier in 1534 and ending with the cession of New France to Great Britain and Spain in 1763 under the Treaty of Paris. Okay, what would have happened if France had kept its American territories known as New France? And this question and all the posters that I'm going to be reading, they were created back in 2016 on Quota. So I'm going to be reading the first one. Okay, here's the answer. Here's the first answer post. France wouldn't have kept it for long. U.S. settlers were already pressing into that territory, and American expansionists were already clamoring for the seizure of New Orleans, or La Nouvelle Orleans, as a necessary outlet for the produce of the American interior. Indeed, U.S. President Thomas Jefferson had already wanted the French that France's possession of La Nouvelle Orleans, or New Orleans, a port through which 40% of American produce went to market, as seen as a hostile act. So the writing was already on the wall. France had neither a significant presence in the area to resist the U.S. encroachment or outright invasion, nor with the sea lanes under the control of the hostile British. Would it have been easy to transport and support a French army there? From Napoleon's perspective, the Louisiana territory was useless to France, was impossible to hold, and sooner or later was going to get seized by either the Americans or the British. So he figured he might as well get something for it. And so the way it worked out is that Thomas Jefferson sent a delegation to negotiate the purchase of just a small part of that territory. New Orleans, or La Nouvelle Orleans, and the surrounding region. For just that region, the U.S. negotiators were willing to offer up to $10 million. To the U.S. negotiators' surprise, Napoleon offered to sell the U.S. not just that city and its endeavors, but for an extra $5 million, he would toss in all of France's territory in order to get it off the hands off his hands and get at least something in exchange. So, for just $15 million, or the equivalent of $240 million in current 2016 US dollars, America ended up with the bargain of not just the century, but probably the millennium. Here's another post. France was stripped of its American territories after the 7 Years' War by the Treaty of Paris in 1763. At that time, the French territories in the New World were minimum and, in the event, indefensible. The population of the English colonies in the New World was estimated at 1.5 million, that of New France at 70,000. This minimum population was scattered over an area roughly bounded by the Atlantic Ocean to the north, Hudson Bay to the north, and the Gulf of Mexico in the south. To the south, the colony of Louisiana, or Louisiane in French, included the entire Mississippi Valley, yet there were no more than 2,500 French settlers and 1,500 slaves in that region. These few had to share the land with 35,000 indigenous people. The indigenous people formed alliances with them to gain access to weapons and shoot. The Treaty of Paris stripped France of all of these lands, of which they were hardly mastered, but rather interpreters gaining a period living from the land. The question supposes that France could have kept its American territories. The fact is that they could not have done so. They were pressed on the east by the American colonies, with a much larger population that hungered for more land. Excuse me. It is often suggested that Jefferson made a clever deal when he paid Napoleon $15 million for the entire territory of Louisiana, or Louisiane. But this land was largely empty, populated by indigenous people, with a few forts built by the French. Napoleon was a military man, accustomed to taking what he wanted by force. He understood that the Mississippi Valley was useless to the French and would sooner or later be invaded by the American colonists. No doubt he considered the Americans gullible to pay for land they could easily have seized. The French had watched the British struggle to hold on to their colonies along the Atlantic coast, which were far more accessible to them than the interior of Louisiana was to the French. Frequently, those people who are not historically educated assume that the events of history could have been changed as easily as drawing lines on a map. This has seldom been true. The French did not so much abandon New France as the concealed to its interval lost. The answer to the question is, therefore, that nothing would have changed if France had tried to keep New France, primarily because it never possessed it in any real sense. I found some more stuff about New France, so I'm going to read more of that. Why were women sent to New France? In order for New France to prosper, people were needed. Thus, the king decided to send women to the colony. For a period of 7 years, the King of France sent an expansive several thousand young women to New France, whom the majority of came from the Paris area or the least of Rion. When did women come to New France? Between 1663 and 1673. Unmarried women supported by the king to immigrate to New France between 1663 and 1673. Private interest gave priority to bringing over male workers, and the French government and religious communities wanted to correct the gender imbalance in the colonies. Who came to New France and why? French traders established settlements at Quebec and Montreal along the St. Lawrence River in the early 1600s. French Jesuits also traveled to the colony to bring Catholicism to native people, but New France forced primarily but New France focused primarily on the fur trade. Why did they call it New France? The name Gaila Nova, New France or Nouvelle France or La Nouvelle France was first recorded in 1529 on a map prepared by the brother of Giovanni di Verrazzano, who in the service of France had explored the coasts of North America in 1524 from what is now the Carolinas north to Nova Scotia. New France eventually became absorbed within the United States and Canada, with the only vigueurs of French rule being the tiny islands of Saint Pierre and Miquelon. In the United States, the legacy of New France includes numerous place names, as well as small pockets of French-speaking communities. I know I'm not going to get a lot of views on this video. I know I'm not going to get a lot of views on this voice recording because, I got some subscribers who are just not interested in stuff like this. I don't care. I don't care, It's my channel. I can do whatever I want. So there. Okay, the state of Louisiana has a strong connection with France. I saw that when I was in Louisiana. I went to Louisiana a lot, but I didn't go to the parts that have a strong French heritage. A place in Louisiana or a city in Louisiana that I went to that had a strong French heritage was Natchitoches, Louisiana. I did some videos there, disastrous videos, garbage videos. And I saw the French style buildings there. The names of the streets were in French. Everything else was in English. Yeah, the French language does exist in Louisiana, but it's not as strong. It's kind of weak because nobody in Louisiana speaks French, barely. Some people, small amounts, not all. Is this because I went to the northern part of Louisiana and the central part of Louisiana where Natchitoches was located at. I heard on France 24 English that the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, visited New Orleans. And I'm going to read something from NPR and Red River Radio about this. And this already happened, so I'm going to go ahead and read this. French President Emmanuel Macron was in New Orleans yesterday, the first visit by a French president in nearly 50 years. Sarah McCammon, host. For the first time in almost 50 years, a French head of state visited New Orleans this week. Louisiana is a former French colony, and the state welcomed President Emmanuel Macron. Carly Burton from member station WWNO in New Orleans reports. Carly Benton by live music poured into the streets as President Macron arrived in New Orleans. The first step for the French president, the French Quarter. Crowds gathered as he toured the city's historic district. Timba Barrier is a French citizen, an exchange student who happens to be spending the semester in New Orleans. Barnier said he was pleased to see his president mingling with the crowd. Timber Barr, and he just took the time to speak to us, to give interest in what we were saying to him. So it was very unexpected, but for a good way. Berlin, in his speech, Macron remarked on what he called the unique history of New Orleans. America, France, and Africa are all represented here, he said. He's speaking here viva an interpreter. President Emmanuel Macron. It is the history of men and women of all colors that did not speak the same language, that did not have the same religion, the same faith, but who in the end got together for one single reason. Berlin. That reason, Macron said, was to build a common future. Earlier in the day, he met with Louisiana's governor. The two pledged to abide by a climate change agreement. It would appoint a kind of climate change ambassador from France to come to the state. Louisiana Governor John Bel Edwards said it could open up an economic relationship as well. John Bel Edwards. We'll also look for opportunities for Louisiana companies to directly engage in France. Berlin. Macron had several other meetings, including a brief and mysterious conversation with Elon Musk. The meeting with the billionaire Twitter owner was not previously scheduled. Macron said in a tweet the two had a, quote, clear and honest discussion about topics including the environment and online content moderation. At the end of the night, Macron finished his speech with a famous New Orleans saying, "Long live France, long live Louisiana, and let the good times roll." Vive Louisiane. Vive la France. Vive la Louisiane. Even though New France was absorbed into Canada, the United States, and the tiny islands of St. Pierre and Miquelon off the coast of Canada's Newfoundland and Labrador province, even though New France was absorbed into these entities, um, French exists here in North America, and it does. In Canada, French is one of the two official languages of the country. French is spoken primarily in Quebec. Well, French in Quebec is basically the official language. Yeah, in Quebec, they're very hardcore on preserving their culture in the French language. You know, they have these hardcore inspectors coming into businesses in Quebec, Canada's francophone province, where they go into places and make sure everything's in French and not in English. If if they see something that's not in French and it's in English, that person who's the owner of that business will be severely punished. And also, if you're in Quebec, if you go up to someone, I say in Quebec City, Montreal, or Montreal, or any, or Sherbrooke, if you go up and start speaking to someone in English, that person will look at you like you're nuts. They look at you like you're crazy because, well, they want you to speak to them. They feel that they, as a French speaker, and you speak to them in English, is just disgusting. It's an insult. And you have also in Canada, New Brunswick or Nouveau Brunswick. Um, that province in Canada is bilingual. Is both English and French, just like the rest of the country. So yeah, French is very strong in that part of North America, but in the United States or Etats-Unis, French is kind of weak. You got the French language in Missouri called Missouri French or Pawpaw French. It's spoken by elder the elderly people, and they're the descendants of people who came to France, to North America, which was the New France colony or Nouvelle France. So as those French speakers die out, the language is near extinction. You Also, French spoken in the northern part of Maine, the state of Maine, which is basically Acadian French. Yeah, it's on the chopping block and it's dying off. And you go to like in Louisiana, like the southern part of the state, French is spoken in the southern part of the state, which is in an area that's that's grouped up by a bunch of parishes. Well, parishes are the equivalent of counties in other states in the U.S. So Louisiana doesn't have counties; they have parishes, and they have 64 of them. Yeah, because Louisiana was both a French and Spanish colony. The French speakers who lived in a southern part of Louisiana called Acadiana, actually they're the descendants of Acadians who were kicked out of Canada and they went south into Louisiana. Others went to the 13 British colonies on the east coast of North America, and others went to France. Why is French is on the decline in the United States? And I found something on Quota titled, "Why was the French language banned in Louisiana?" It was not exactly banned. It was deemed a foreign language, despite it's less foreign than English. Starting in 1916 to 1921, and as a result, education in French could not be performed. French could only be a foreign language class, and such classes were often not available. Louisiana was also Anglicized in its institutions since it was conquered and occupied by the Union Army in 1862. The Constitution of 1864 imposed by the Union removed bilingualism. In the post-occupation Constitution of 1868, there was an article saying no law shall require judicial process to be issued in any language other than the English language. Perhaps these constitutions introduced some provisions for blacks that would quickly be abolished by the Louisiana Democrats, but it reduced the status of French in Louisiana. As of now, there are no official languages in Louisiana. In those new English schools in Louisiana, the policy was, of course, assimilation. Children were chastised and humiliated when they spoke French in those schools. In order to separate their children, separate in order to spare their children this humiliation, they let them assemble and never learn French, and those children, since they lost the language, would often lose their identity shortly after, or that identity would become completely alienated and removed by its proper content. The current supremacy of the so-called Cajun identity is a conquest and assimilation and the loss of the cultural content of French Louisiana. And Cajunization process that occurred ever since the 1960s, and its communalization is a plague in a nuisance. The Cajun supremacy is a foreign imposed look on the realities of French Louisiana. The more Louisiana will be Cajun, the less it will understand its own cultural content. The Cajun identity is also a sort of white supremacist because it denies the ethnic heroization of Louisiana that is previously reflected in the majority's Creole identity before everything was relabeled Cajun. This is why it exclusively used the proper Cajun term when referring to that subcategory Creoles of Acadian ancestry. The French population of Louisiana is very diverse in terms of its origin. Despite this diversity, French Louisiana is now usually associated exclusively with Cajun, a word which would recently be considered derogatorily. The beautification of Cajun identity began to take place in the late 1960s. It was followed by a general Cajunization of the white French Louisiana identities in the regional ethnic territories. However, this process of Cajunization remains incomplete because black Creoles and French-speaking Indians remain undivulged. Hence, the apparent ethnic homogeneity of French Louisiana, viewed from the outside, contrasts sharply with the cultural variety of its communities. Okay, I'm going to stop there. So, so after reading that, that is why the French language in the United States is weak and non-existent. It's kind of sad. I wish Louisiana was francophone If it was, I'll go over to that state and learn French. Yeah, and they'll have some French classes there. So, yeah, yeah, Louisiana to me, it's basically America's Quebec, but it's not like Quebec in Canada. Yeah, so I haven't learned French, so if I get the chance, I'll learn it. I can say a few things in French, and that's about it. So not a lot. So that's all I gotta say in this video. Au revoir or au revoir.